Why, there it is. I can see it. Well, what are they going to give me? Well, the government gives you everything.
How does a man who didn't even want to act become the most famous villain in Hollywood? Lionel Barrymore hated acting at first. He wanted to be a painter, but life had other plans. Over time, he turned into the bad guy everyone loved to hate. From Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life to Scrooge on the radio, he made villains unforgettable. Even in a wheelchair and in constant pain, he kept acting. But how did he go from a man who didn't like acting to one of the most respected stars in Hollywood? This is the full, shocking story of Lionel Barrymore. Lionel Herbert Blythe, later known as Lionel Barrymore, was born on April 28, 1878, in Philadelphia. His family was already famous in American theater. His grandmother, Louisa Lane Drew, managed the Arch Street Theater, a very important place in Philadelphia. Lionel's first time on stage didn't go well. When he was just 6 years old, someone pushed him onto the stage, but instead of saying his lines, he cried. This showed that acting wasn't something he loved right away. The family's name, Barrymore, wasn't even their original name. His father changed it from Blythe because Barrymore sounded more impressive for the theater world. Lionel's parents had very dramatic lives. His father, Maurice Barrymore, was once shot in the chest during a card game in Texas. This happened in 1879, just before Lionel's sister Ethel was born. Maurice survived, and the story became part of theater legends. Lionel's mother, Georgiana Drew, came from a family of famous actors too. She started acting in 1872, but her life was cut short when she died of tuberculosis in 1893. Lionel was only 15 when he lost his mother. This loss was very hard for the family. Just a year later, Maurice remarried, which upset Ethel a lot. Maurice was also known for having affairs, and his scandals were often in the newspapers. Lionel had 2 siblings, Ethel and John, and they were all famous in the theater world. But their relationship was not very close. Once, a dinner guest was shocked by how formal they were with each other and said, "My God, don't you know each other?" Even though they were all actors, they only appeared in one movie together, Rasputin and the Empress, in 1932. Ethel had an interesting life and even turned down Winston Churchill's proposal because she thought he wouldn't have a successful future. The siblings were raised as Roman Catholics, influenced by a Polish actress, Helena Modjeska, but only Ethel stayed religious as an adult. Lionel didn't want to act at first. He wanted to be an artist. He went to Paris to study painting, which he loved more than acting. He was also very talented in music and created many compositions, including piano and orchestra pieces. Some of his works were even published. He also made etchings and was recognized for his art, with his works included in important collections. Lionel had a studio and shop at his home in Los Angeles. He once said, "I didn't want to act. I wanted to paint or draw. The theater was not in my blood. It was like an in-law I had to live with." But financial problems forced him back to acting. Lionel Barrymore made his stage debut in 1893 at the age of 15. The performance took place on November 28th at the auditorium in Kansas City, where he acted alongside his grandmother, Louisa Lane Drew, in The Rivals. Despite his reluctance to be on stage, this moment marked the beginning of a long and legendary career. Barrymore later admitted that he did not perform well, saying, "I stunk." The production was significant because it brought 3 generations of his theatrical family together on one stage. His grandmother played the famous role of Mrs. Malaprop, while Lionel, still a teenager, was pushed into the spotlight. Although his acting skills were not exceptional at the time, this debut started a career that lasted more than 60 years. In September 1900, Barrymore's career took a major step forward when he performed in Sag Harbor at the Republic Theater. The play ran for 76 performances and was a turning point for him. Written by James A. Hearn, it was a rural comedy set in a seaside village in New York, involving two brothers in a love triangle. Barrymore played Frank Turner, one of the brothers, showcasing his ability to take on complex roles. The success of this play led to more opportunities on Broadway. He performed in notable productions like The Brixton Burglary and The Second in Command, which had a long run of 128 performances at the Empire Theater. These roles cemented his place as a talented actor on the Broadway stage. In 1911, Barrymore's financial struggles led him to the Biograph Company, run by D.W. Griffith. This move began his journey into the growing film industry. At first, he earned $10 a day for acting and $25 for writing scripts. Between 1911 and 1915, he appeared in more than 70 short films. He played all kinds of roles, from small parts to major ones. His big break came in 1912 with The New York Hat, where he acted with the famous Mary Pickford. People loved how he played sly and crafty characters, so he often got cast as villains. Some of his best performances during the silent film era were in movies like The Temptress, 1926, with Greta Garbo, The Show, 1927, with John Gilbert, Sadie Thompson, 1928, with Gloria Swanson, and West of Zanzibar, 1928, with Lon Chaney. When silent films changed to talking pictures in 1929, MGM was looking for directors to help with the transition. Barrymore volunteered and directed Madame X that same year. It was a big hit, and people thought he might win a Best Director Academy Award, even though there weren't official nominations back then. At first, people worried his raspy voice would hurt his career, but it actually became one of his trademarks. His unique voice, combined with his strong screen presence, helped him move easily from silent films to talkies. He was one of the first actors to succeed in both silent and sound films. Barrymore's most famous moment came in 1931 with the movie A Free Soul. His performance, especially a powerful courtroom monologue, earned him an Academy Award for Best Actor. This movie also helped launch Clark Gable's career. Gable played a tough gangster so convincingly that it made him a star. Barrymore also tried directing for a few years. After the success of Madame X, he directed movies like His Glorious Night, 1929, and Rogue Song, 1930. But his slow and careful directing style caused delays on set. His last film as a director was 10 Cents a Dance, 1931, starring Barbara Stanwyck. Even though she gave a great performance, the movie suffered because of his slow pacing. MGM decided not to let him direct anymore, but they kept him on as an actor. Barrymore later admitted that understanding what audiences wanted was tough for him. He said, "It's easy to fail. I don't think I failed as a director, but the work was too exhausting." Despite the challenges, he remained an important figure in Hollywood for years. Lionel Barrymore's life changed forever on December 24, 1936. That Christmas Eve, his second wife, Irene Fenwick, died at their home in Beverly Hills at just 49 years old. She had been battling anorexia nervosa, though in those days, people often called it over-dieting. Her death came at the worst time. The next day, Barrymore was supposed to perform his annual radio broadcast of A Christmas Carol. But with his grief overwhelming him, his brother John had to step in and take over the role of Scrooge. Losing Irene broke Barrymore's heart. He couldn't bear to stay in their home on Roxbury Drive after she was gone. Instead, he moved in with the Wheeler family, who had helped care for Irene during her illness. He refused to let the house change. It became a place frozen in time, filled with Irene's things just as she had left them. He hired a caretaker to keep the yard neat and a housekeeper to clean the inside, ensuring the house remained spotless. The brass door knocker shone, the rooms stayed dust-free, and everything felt as though Irene might walk back through the door at any moment. For 13 long years, Barrymore kept the house as a tribute to Irene. He couldn't live there, but he couldn't let it go either. He visited sometimes to remember her, but the pain was too much to move back. Keeping the house was expensive, and by 1949, money troubles forced him to sell it. Along with the house, he had to part with many of Irene's belongings, using the money to pay off taxes. It was a heartbreaking end to a long period of mourning. The year 1936 brought another challenge for Barrymore. He suffered a terrible fall when he leaned on a drafting board, which tipped over and caused him to break his hip. The injury was severe, but with time, he slowly relearned how to walk. Unfortunately, his luck didn't hold. Just a year later, in 1937, while working on the film Saratoga with Clark Gable, he tripped over a cable on set. He fell hard and broke his hip again. These accidents, along with the arthritis that had troubled him since the 1920s, made it nearly impossible for Barrymore to walk without great pain. By this time, he had already been using strong pain medication for years. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, stood by Barrymore when he faced a tough time with his disability. Mayer understood how serious Barrymore's condition was and made sure that MGM's scripts were adjusted to help him. Writers were told to create scenes where Barrymore's characters could sit behind desks, lie in beds, or use wheelchairs. This made it possible for Barrymore to keep acting even with his challenges. Thanks to these changes, Barrymore continued to work and appeared in over 40 films after his second accident. He and Mayer had been good friends even before 1924, when MGM was formed. Their friendship became even more important during this hard time in Barrymore's life. Mayer's support allowed Barrymore to stay in the industry and keep doing what he loved. Barrymore didn't let his disability stop him. Instead, he turned it into a strength. This was clear in his role as Dr. Leonard Gillespie in the Dr. Kildare series, which started in 1938. In these films, his wheelchair wasn't treated as a limitation. It became part of his character, but the storylines didn't focus on it. His performance showed that disability could be normal in Hollywood. Lionel Barrymore became famous for playing Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. But his experience as a villain started earlier. During the 1940s, he regularly played Ebenezer Scrooge on CBS Radio's A Christmas Carol, which helped him develop the sharp, cold-hearted style he used for Potter. Interestingly, Barrymore wasn't even the first choice for the role. Director Frank Capra had considered other actors, like Dan Duryea and Charles Bickford. Barrymore used a wheelchair because of a hip injury and severe arthritis, but he turned this into part of Potter's character, making it seem like the wheelchair was due to polio. His performance was so powerful that, years later, the American Film Institute ranked Mr. Potter as the 6th greatest villain in American cinema history. Something shocking happened in 1947. The FBI accused It's a Wonderful Life of being communist propaganda. On May 26th, they sent a memo about the film, saying it used tricks common in communist movies. They thought casting Barrymore as a greedy, mean banker was a way to criticize rich people unfairly. Even Ayn Rand, a famous writer and philosopher, helped the FBI analyze the film. The investigation got so serious that the House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings about it in October that year. The FBI even suggested that Mr. Potter should have been shown as someone protecting money, not stealing it. Mr. Potter's character became more important over time. When the movie first came out, it was a failure at the box office and lost $525,000 for RKO Studios. But in 1974, its copyright expired, so TV stations started showing it for free. This turned the film into a Christmas favorite. Critics noticed something surprising about the story. Mr. Potter steals $8,000 and never gets punished. Adjusted for today's value, that's over $135,000. Barrymore's portrayal was so iconic that when Orson Welles played Potter in a TV remake, he struggled to live up to it. The character of Mr. Potter has remained relevant for decades. During financial crises, like the one in 2008, people saw him as a symbol of greedy bankers. His role seemed like a warning about how dangerous unchecked corporate power could be. Now, even in 2024, Paramount Pictures is working on a modern remake of the film, showing how much Mr. Potter still resonates as a villain who represents corporate greed. From 1934 to 1953, Lionel Barrymore became famous for playing Ebenezer Scrooge on the radio. His first performance as Scrooge was on December 25, 1934, during a CBS Christmas party sponsored by Nash Lafayette. This marked the start of a beloved holiday tradition in America. Over 20 years, Barrymore played Scrooge 18 times on the radio, plus once for an MGM studio recording. His portrayal was so realistic that he once said in a 1947 interview, "I seem to shrink, and an unnatural meanness of disposition comes over me. I seem to be Scrooge in body and mind." His performances captured the spirit of the character and made him a key part of Christmas for many people. Barrymore only missed playing Scrooge twice during his long run. The first time was in 1936, when his wife, Irene, died on Christmas Eve. His brother, John Barrymore, stepped in for him, keeping the tradition alive. The second time was in 1938. Many believed illness was the reason, but it was more complicated. Barrymore was able to perform that year, as shown by his narration in MGM's radio version of A Christmas Carol. However, Orson Welles took over for the CBS broadcast on December 23, 1938, giving his own energetic take on Scrooge. Barrymore's performances made A Christmas Carol incredibly popular in the United States. His radio broadcasts aired on major networks and reached millions of listeners each year. These shows became so successful that MGM Records released a recording of Barrymore as Scrooge in 1947. It was re-released many times over the years, showing how much people loved it. Barrymore worked with talented artists like composer Sam Timberg, known for his work on Superman cartoons and Betty Boop animations. His last performance as Scrooge was on December 20, 1953, during the Hallmark Hall of Fame show. Barrymore changed how character acting was done during Hollywood's golden age. He turned his physical challenges into strengths, making his roles unforgettable. Even though he was considered just a character actor, he acted in more than 200 films, showing how versatile he was. He also became a holiday favorite for millions of people, with his yearly radio performance as Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, which he did every year from 1934 to 1953. Interestingly, acting wasn't even his first choice. He wanted to be a painter. But despite this, he became one of the most admired actors in Hollywood. Director Frank Capra, who was one of the most famous directors of that time, said Barrymore was the humblest, most cooperative actor he had ever worked with. This shows how professional and dedicated Barrymore was, even though he lived with constant physical pain. In his later years, Barrymore kept acting even though his health was getting worse. His last role in a movie was playing Andrew Jackson in Lone Star, 1952. After that, he appeared as himself in Main Street to Broadway, 1953. Even when his health was failing, he continued his radio work and kept performing as Scrooge every Christmas. On November 15, 1954, at the age of 76, he died of a heart attack in Van Nuys, California. His death brought an end to an amazing career that lasted 61 years. He worked through the era of silent films, talkies, radio, and even the early days of television. He was buried next to his second wife, Irene, at Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles. Barrymore's legacy is more than just the movies and radio shows he left behind. He also showed that actors with physical disabilities could succeed in Hollywood, paving the way for future performers with similar challenges.